inquest touching the death of Azaria Chamberlain resumed. Decision. On the 13th of August of 1980, Pastor and Mrs. Chamberlain and their three children, Aidan Lee, 6 years, Reagan Michael, 4 years, and Azaria Chamberlain, then 9 weeks old, left their home in Mount Isa to holiday in the Northern Territory. They stayed overnight that Wednesday at the Devil's Marbles, south of Tennant Creek, and spent the following 2 nights at the Heavy Tree Gap Caravan Park, Alice Springs. On the 16th of August, they all travelled to Ayers Rock, arriving there approximately 1 hour after sunset. They registered at the Ranger's office and selected the quieter of the then 2 campsites available, a site at the eastern end of what is called the Top Caravan Park, or camping area. This site is immediately adjacent to sand dune country, carrying sparse arid to semi-arid vegetation typical of that region. There the Chamberlains set up a hiking tent, variously described as a 2, 3 or 4 man tent, had tea, fed Azaria and retired for the night. The following morning, Pastor Chamberlain, a keen photographer, photographed the effect of sunrise on Ayers Rock, took other photographs and returned about 8 a.m. Thereafter the family breakfast and went sightseeing around the northern side of the rock, including the aerodrome, and arrived at the base of the climb at approximately 11:30 a.m. The pastor climbed the rock alone and returned at about 1:30 p.m. He then reclimbed, taking with him the 2 boys, Aidan and Reagan. During the pastor's first climb, Mrs. Chamberlain sat at the base of the climb, minding her children and conversing with an elderly couple. Subsequent investigations found the couple to be Mr. and Mrs. Wilkins of South Australia. Mrs. Wilkins had a short nurse of Azaria and in her evidence stated that from her observations of Mrs. Chamberlain that day, she considered her a perfect mother. They parted without exchanging names and addresses, but the Wilkins contacted the police after identifying Mrs. Chamberlain in press photographs and on TV. Perhaps this fact provides some food for thought for the many people who have drawn adverse inferences because the Chamberlains cooperated with the media. They then went to Maggie Springs and other sites in the area, including Fertility Cave, where they observed a dingo watching them. Finally, they returned to their camp. It was then nearing sunset. The older children were showered and dressed for bed, and the family travelled to near Sunset Strip, and Pastor Chamberlain photographed the effect of sunset on the rock. Reagan went to sleep in the car and was transferred to his sleeping bag immediately upon the family's return to their campsite. There, Pastor Chamberlain commenced preparing tea at the barbecue area nearby. Mrs. Chamberlain tidied the tent while Aidan nursed Azaria in the car. Her task completed, Mrs. Chamberlain zipped the tent, took Azaria from Aidan, and the 3 returned to the cooking area. While there, they talked to a couple with a young child, and Aidan had his tea. Whilst watching a mouse at their feet, a dingo sprang out of the darkness and ate it. Azaria by now was asleep, and Mrs. Chamberlain returned to the tent and put her down in a bassinet at the rear or eastern end of the tent. Aidan, who had accompanied his mother to the tent, asked for more food. Together they left the tent, obtained a can of beans from the car and returned to the cooking area 22 metres distant. Mrs. Chamberlain was about to open the can of beans when Pastor Chamberlain heard a cry from Azaria. He described this as short and seemingly urgent. He informed his wife, who although she had not heard the cry, immediately went to attend to the child. Approaching the tent and some 10 metres distant from it, she saw what she described as the shoulders and lower neck of a dingo coming out of the tent entrance. The dingo appeared to have its head lowered as if trying to extract something it had in its mouth. It was shaking its head as if trying to loosen whatever was there. Firstly, she thought it was one of the shoes she had arranged inside the entrance when tidying the tent. She quickened her pace, then thought of Azaria and commenced to run, yelling at the dingo to go away. The dingo came out of the entrance and made off around the southern side of the tent. Upon entering the tent, she saw the baby's blankets scattered around the floor. She thinks she began calling then, but it may have been a few seconds later, after she had quickly searched the bassinet and tent and emerged from it, that what could be called a hue and cry really commenced. Firstly, she ran around the south side of the tent and to a position between the rear of the tent and their car. From there, she saw a dingo standing at the rear of the car. She yelled, and it made off into the adjacent sandhill area. It was this observation of the dingo that caused the subsequent search to be directed to the south and east of the campsite. Mrs. Chamberlain's movements from the time she had been seated on the rail at the cooking area were observed by Aidan, who had accompanied her to the tent when Azaria was put down for the night, and also by the witnesses, Mr. and Mrs. Lowe of Hobart, Tasmania. Mrs. Lowe described how she saw the baby kicking her legs while she, Mrs. Lowe, was talking to Mrs. Chamberlain. This evidence was further corroborated by Mr. and Mrs. West of Esperance, South Australia. They occupied the campsite adjoining and to the north of that occupied by the Chamberlains. Immediately before she heard Mrs. Chamberlain cry, my God, the dingo has got my baby," she heard a canine growl outside her tent. This evidence raises a very strong possibility, indeed almost a certainty, that there was more than one canine in the vicinity that night. My impressions of Mrs. Wilkins, Mr. and Mrs. Lowe and Mrs. West was that they were straightforward, truthful people, accurately relating the events to which they attested. It would be hard to imagine more independent witnesses. The nearest any of them lived to each other is about 1,000 kilometres, and none live less than 1,500 kilometres from the Chamberlains. They met in passing in a remote area, and apart from this tragedy, would no doubt have quickly forgotten each other. One came forward at the behest of the media. The others were painstakingly traced by the efforts of Detective Sergeant Charlwood for motor vehicle registration numbers recorded by rangers at Ayers Rock. Each was interviewed by the police force of their home state. The written accounts they gave to the police and subsequently attested to in court do not vary in any material substance. I confidently rely on each of their words. Upon the alarm being raised, a search was immediately organised under the joint command of Senior Constable Morris and the Head Ranger of Uluru National Park, Mr. Roth. The scope and nature of this search and the manner in which the manpower of residents and tourists was marshalled is largely a credit to the cooperation and intelligence of these two officers. That the searches, initiated that night and on subsequent days, proved unsuccessful should not be used as criticism of the efforts of all concerned. Another occurrence of significance occurred when Peter John Elston, a Chartair pilot, and Richard Duldig called at the Kaywood residence during the night after completing their part of the search. In the course of conversation, Elston stated to police that they remained with Val Kaywood for a short time while she and her children looked around their property because their view was that a dingo does normally bring its prey around a house. Her husband did not support this theory when giving evidence, but did state he had learnt that all the surrounds of houses had been searched that night at some unknown person's instigation. It would appear that at least one unknown person held such a belief in that supposed behavioural habit of a dingo. I should state here that I accept Mr. Kaywood's evidence and do not in any way suggest that either he or any member of his family became involved with the disposal of Azaria's body. In view of the evidence of Dr. Scott of spray bloodstaining on the southern and northeastern corners of the tent, and the evidence of Mrs. West that she heard a canine growl, it seems highly likely that Mrs. Chamberlain saw another dingo at the rear of the family car. Thus the search, from its inception, possibly set off in a totally wrong direction. No fault for this error lies with anyone. Mrs. Chamberlain did all one would expect of her, and the officers mentioned applied their best endeavours to the situation presented to them. However, on all the evidence presented to me, I find it more probable that there were two dingoes at the scene and the one carrying the baby travelled in a northerly direction. Assistance was sought and readily given from the Aboriginal community residing at the park, both in the free supply of torches from their store for the night searching and for subsequent tracking of suspect dingoes. Whilst this searching revealed the tracks of a dingo carrying or dragging something, the evidence of Dr. Jones would indicate that the rest spots pointed out to police by the Aborigines should have contained blood staining. No such blood staining was discovered. Had they existed, an Aborigine would most certainly have observed them. Searching was finally abandoned, and it was not until the following Sunday afternoon that Mr. Goodwin of Dandenong, Victoria, discovered the baby's clothing near the southwest end of the rock. Again, upon the police being advised, commendable efforts were made to preserve the scene of this discovery. It was the opinion of all who observed this scene on that afternoon that the clothes had been deliberately placed in that position and the surrounding growth had not been disturbed. Such opinions were substantiated by the position of the clothing. The singlet was found to be inside the jumpsuit and the jumpsuit partly on top of the nappy. The booties were within the legs of the jumpsuit and all the clothing was within an area of 12 to 18 inches. This clothing was photographed in the position in which it was found and also spread out on display. It was then carefully gathered and transmitted to Adelaide for scientific examination at the Institute of Medical and Veterinary Science. Much scientific evidence has been received in this inquisition, but such evidence falls into many categories. Much evidence, embraced in the term forensic science, is no more than the evidence of witnesses' accounts of his observation of physical matter, whether under magnification or not. Such evidence is preferably led, when supported by photographs, to enable the tribunal concerned to reach its own conclusions as to whether or not the observations were accurate. However, such evidence is nonetheless admissible because without photographic support, and the court receives such evidence, subject of course to the veracity and credit it accords the witness concerned. Evidence from witnesses in what could be called the pure sciences or professions, medicine or law, is receivable if the witness concerned is shown to be properly qualified and experienced within the particular discipline of learning upon which he seeks to express his opinion. Such professional expert witnesses may not only give evidence of their own opinions, but may also refer to works of other authorities within the discipline in question. The evidence of Sergeant Cox of the South Australian Police Force is an instance of the former class, and the evidence of Dr. Scott and Dr. Jones is are classic examples of the latter. The clothing was examined in Adelaide by a variety of experts. Mr. Kuchel, an experienced botanist, examined the clothing on its arrival and later examined matter removed from the clothing, such as dirt by gravity and other materials by vacuuming. His examination revealed that the clothing had almost certainly been buried, either on its own or with the body. This, he concluded, because of the large amounts of loose sand found in the clothing and the dirt ingrained in a fold mark on the lower portion of the singlet. From the nature of the foliage depicted in the colour photographs, Exhibit AE, he stated the clothing had been left at the scene where it had been found by a human and the nappy subsequently interfered with by birds. The clothing revealed the presence of 7 known plant species, the prominent one being Parieteria delibris, found growing only in damp sheltered areas around the base of Ayers Rock. From the manner in which these species had been forced into the clothing, he concluded that the clothes had been deliberately rubbed in foliage somewhere along the base of the rock, where such species would have been growing at that time of the year. Because soil at the scene where the clothing was found contained an abundance of charcoal, he concluded that the insertion of plant material had occurred elsewhere, rather than at the spot where the clothing was found. Later, because of the absence of pulled threads on the clothing and the nature of the vegetation which existed en route between the campsite and the place where the clothing was found, he concluded a dingo had not carried or dragged the clothing over that distance. The evidence given by Sergeant Cox may best be dealt with next. He examined the clothing on its arrival at Adelaide and observed the same phenomena. The loose, sandy soil, ingrained vegetable matter, etc., as did Mr. Kuchel. He further examined the cut marks on the collar of the jumpsuit and the hole in the sleeve. Because the ends of the threads were sharp and unravelled in the hole in the collar, he concluded that it had been cut with a cutting instrument and not torn. Because of the nature of the end of the cut, he concluded that the cutting instrument was a scissors, not a knife. His examination of the sleeve led him to believe it had been cut twice with the scissors whilst weight was being applied to tauten the material, because it had torn slightly between the two cuts and more extensively after the last cut. His examination of the thread ends of these cuts disclosed that the sides of the threads were blood-stained whilst the ends were clean. From this he concluded that the material had been cut and torn after the blood on it had become dry. Although Sergeant Cox was subjected to cross-examination as to his qualifications as an expert, I accept that he had the powers of perception and deduction to give the evidence. I accept also that if such evidence requires the witness to be an expert, he possesses the necessary expertise to venture the opinions he did. Dr. Scott, a forensic biologist, gave evidence of testing all the blood samples and specimens submitted. Also of a special test he formulated to test for traces of dog and dingo saliva in clothing. Using this formula, Dr. Scott tested the jumpsuit. At each point, he considered a dingo might have bitten it whilst carrying the child. He found no trace of saliva at any such point and concluded none had ever been present. Therefore, if the child had been removed from the tent by a dingo clutching her head or neck, some intervention occurred before an opportunity arose for the dingo to otherwise maul the body of the child. Dr. Scott also attested to blood analysis he conducted on various exhibits. From blood samples voluntarily supplied by the parents, he concluded that any of their children would have a blood group O, HP21, PGM11, or group A, HP21, PGM11. For children under approximately 6 months, further hemoglobin typing can take place to locate hemoglobin HB capital F, often called fetal blood. He found fetal hemoglobin in blood group type O, HP21, PGM11 on a blanket, sleeping bag, singlet, jumpsuit and green parka. Thus, blood on these items could have come from a child of Pastor and Mrs. Chamberlain. Other blood smears, stains, etc. substantiated this possibility. He concluded, because of blood staining, that the singlet had been worn the correct side out at the time the staining occurred. This conclusion supports the strong assertion by Mrs. Chamberlain that she would never have put her baby's singlet on inside out, and, if accurate, destroys almost totally the inferences sought to be drawn from the evidence of Dr. Brown. I will deal with Dr. Brown's evidence later. Dr. Scott stated and explained with clarity how the blood staining to the neck and back of the jumpsuit suggests that the child was being held upright at the time of bleeding. This evidence, incapable of, I find, of no other explanation, coincides with the theory that Azaria was taken away by her head or neck in the mouth of a dingo, but is otherwise totally uncharacteristic of any other instant of an infant death. The facts that damage to the jumpsuit was slight, that no blood or tissue was found inside or it, nor dog or dingo saliva adhering to it, appeared inconsistent with the controlled experiment conducted at the Adelaide Zoo. In accepting these inconsistencies, it would appear there are two alternatives. Either Azaria met her death by another cause other than the dingo attack, or else the dingo's possession of the child ended abruptly before it had time to set about devouring the child. From blood staining on the parka, Dr. Scott suggested that the blood had been smeared on it by a bloody object having been dragged over the garment, or the wearer holding a bloody object. Several people crawled around inside the tent that night, and I feel no conclusion ought to be drawn from bloodstains or smears inside the tent. After the December portion of this hearing, and before its resumption last week, Dr. Scott was finally given the tent to examine blood staining on its walls. These stains had been observed by several members of the police force on the 18th of August of 1980, the day after the tragedy. These officers were unable to determine whether the stains were on the outside of the thinly woven material constituting the walls of the tent or the inside. No doubt, to ascertain this significant information, they packaged the tent and forwarded it to the Specialist Group, Crime Services Directorate, Operational Services Command, Forensic Science Section, Darwin. There the tent and its contents were examined by policewoman Constable Fogarty, who stated she did not observe the presence of any bloodstains on its walls. Dr. Scott's examination of the tent walls revealed 3 stained areas of what was described as finely sprayed blood. The 3 groups of stain came from the outside of the tent. He was unable to determine the origin of the blood, whether human or animal, but was inclined to think it may have been animal. He described each spray group as it would have appeared at the campsite. 2 spray stains appeared on the southern side wall, 1 at the western end and 1 about the centre of the wall under the guy rope. The 3rd appeared on the northern end of the rear or eastern end of the tent. Though he felt there was sufficient blood in each group of stains to classify the group for type, Dr. Scott's efforts in this regard proved unsuccessful. Dr. Jones, however, suggests an explanation may well be that chemicals associated with the waterproofing of the tent destroyed the protein content of the blood. Another facet of this evidence that may serve to prove its origin is that Dr. Scott estimates the stain on the southern wall under the guy ropes was sprayed upward at an angle of approximately 45 degrees. The Chamberlains are vegetarians. They apparently had no prior knowledge of the existence of this blood staining. On all the evidence pertaining to these stains, I am satisfied, and satisfied beyond reasonable doubt, the highest degree of proof recognised in law, that the sprays of blood on the exterior of the tent were sprays of arterial blood coming from Azaria's head or neck. Such an explanation accounts for the infrequency of the stains and is supported by the canine growl heard by Mrs. West. It also explains why Mrs. Chamberlain did not observe anything in the mouth of the dingo she chased from the rear of the family's car. The evidence of Dr. Brown, an odontologist, was called to show the possible correlation between the bite of a dingo and marks on and in various items of clothing. I am satisfied that Dr. Brown, an acknowledged expert on bite marks of humans, used his best endeavours to learn what he could of what had been, until the request had been made for his assistance in this case, an unknown field, both for himself or indeed anyone else. In the light of his straightforward admission that he had no experience in examining bite marks in clothing, I feel it would be dangerous to rely on his evidence in that regard. In any event, I accept the evidence of Dr. Scott that the singlet Azaria was wearing on the night of her death was being worn correct side out. This fact alone disposes of most of Dr. Brown's evidence. It reduces to mere speculation and likely error any hypotheses as to the origin of the 2 small holes from which the absence of any blood or tissue staining eliminates the possibility of them being associated with any physical harm befalling the babe. Dr. Newson gave evidence of the dingo as a person who had made and directed particular studies of them over a number of years. He is an acknowledged expert in this field. He suggested that the growl heard by Mrs. West just before the alarm was raised was most likely directed at another dingo or camp dog. He said that the growl was significant as indicative of possibly 2 dingoes in the immediate area of the tent. He indicated that a dingo is unlikely to attack unless provoked, but poses that even an attempt to pat one may be taken as a very provocative act. He had never known of a dingo pup taken from its mother after it was 2 weeks old being capable of being reared in a domestic situation with safety. He regarded the seemingly tame dingoes at Ayers Rock to be potentially more dangerous than the wilder ones which kept out of distance. He spoke of rangers at Ayers Rock attempting to prevent the destruction of these tamer but more dangerous dingoes, to keep them as a tourist attraction. It is not unreasonable to infer that the inclination of many at Ayers Rock to protect dingoes could provide a motive to conceal Azaria's body. On all the evidence, I am certain that the evidence given by Pastor and Mrs. Chamberlain was true, accurate and corroborated by truthful, independent eyewitnesses and the evidence of many experts. Considering the evidence of Dr. Newson and Dr. Scott, I am also satisfied that when the dingo was seen to be tugging at Azaria at the tent doorway, it was holding her by the neck or head, and that at that point she would have sustained multiple fatal injuries to that region of her body. I conclude from the absence of dingo saliva on the jumpsuit that Azaria was being held by the head or neck at all times when possessed by the dingo. I accept the evidence of Sergeant Cox that the cuts to the sleeve and neck of the jumpsuit were caused by a scissors whilst the clothing was under tension. On the probabilities, I find that at Ayers Rock, a scissors would be a tool used by a white person rather than an Aborigine. From the evidence of lack of damage to the clothing, particularly the singlet, which would have been a difficult garment for a dingo to remove undamaged, and the absence of dingo saliva, plus any large numbers of hair, I find that the dingo's possession of Azaria was interrupted by human intervention on the night of the 17th of August 1980. I am satisfied that at the time of such intervention, Azaria would have been dead. The cut sleeve may indicate that after Azaria was retrieved from the dingo, her body was placed at a safe height to prevent further attack, and the scissors had to be used to free the body. This, however, is speculative. I am satisfied that at some stage the clothing was buried in the plain or dune country, subsequently dug up, rubbed on undergrowth near the base of the rock and placed by a person or persons unknown at the spot where it was later found. It may have been that whoever rubbed the clothing on the undergrowth had some knowledge of botany, but again, that is speculation. It would appear the clothing was meant to be found. This may have been to support the proposition that the child had been fully eaten, that it had been taken by a dingo having its lair or den in that area, thus concealing the offending dingo's identity, or for a number of other reasons. Ayers Rock and the Olgas comprise the visible ends of a huge sedimentary conglomerate of great geological and scenic significance. In a territory whose economy is substantially centred on tourism, it is surprising that nobody sought to represent at this inquisition the interests of which department of whatever government is finally responsible and possibly liable for the overall conservation policy at Uluru National Park. In an area where advanced planning is in hand to provide for the overnight needs of upwards of 6,000 tourists, a policy of conservation appears to have been activated that has as its ultimate aim the intermingling of tourists with an ever-increasing number of dingoes, desert death adders, desert brown and king brown snakes. The dingo is a dangerous animal and is known to be dangerous. Prior to the 17th of August 1980, the conservation authorities had received reports of several instances of dingoes attacking children. The significance of a dingo's range and a dingo's territory was known and understood by the rangers. The existence and whereabouts of a number of their lairs were known, and known to be in areas where children might be expected to wander whilst exploring the many areas of interest around the base of the rock. The conduct of dingoes around campsites, together with their propensity to enter tents, was known or ought to have been known. The propensity of a dingo reared by Homo sapiens and treated as a pet in a domesticated environment to violently attack children was known. Yet in the face of this knowledge, dingoes have been retained and indeed allowed to virtually infest the area as a tourist attraction. I would hope that as a moral responsibility to protect children visiting national parks would appear to have been avoided in the past, the legal consequences of such conduct in the future ought lead to the elimination of any species dangerous to man from such parks, or at least from those areas frequented by tourists. Every person in our community is under an obligation to conserve human life, and those charged with the added task of conserving wildlife ought to remember and apply this primary tenet of our law. If those charged with the protection of wildlife within national parks would rely on laws forbidding the destruction of such creatures, then they ought to be made publicised the inherent dangers that exist and are permitted to exist in such parks, and also what medical care would be available in an emergency in such remote regions. Such publicity should be included in any tourist promotion to fulfil the requirements governing fair advertising. This case clearly emphasises that a choice has to be made between dingoes and deadly snakes on one hand and tourism on the other. The two ought not be expected to coexist, creating hidden traps for decent people where formerly our forebears set hidden traps for deadly creatures. Dingoes are not and never have been an endangered species. Despite constant efforts by man, they have held their position as the most dangerous carnivore of the canine species on the Australian continent. Tourists in national parks should be able to observe native fauna in its natural state, but I maintain only from a safe distance. To be able to observe a deadly snake under one's motel bed, as apparently was the fate of one of the media personnel on the court's recent visit to Ayers Rock, appears to be taking the cause of conservation too seriously. Lessons ought to be learnt from this inquest and applied. The death of this babe in an area where previous attacks causing bodily injury or potential bodily injury is too high a price and a totally unnecessary price to pay in the cause of conservation. I recommend that all animals dangerous to man be either safely enclosed or else eliminated from areas of national parks likely to be frequented by man. Once again during this inquisition, I have had occasion to criticise the work performed by the Northern Territory Police Force Forensic Science Section. It was not only the examination of the tent, but also the transcript of the interview of Dr. Corbett by Sergeant Sandry that caused me great apprehension concerning the bona fides of this section. An examination of that transcript reveals that whenever Dr. Corbett made a statement in any way supporting the Chamberlain's account of this tragedy, the topic was immediately changed, obviously to avoid any further evidence emerging that might support the dingo theory. Police forces must realise, or be made to realise, that courts will not tolerate any standard less than complete objectivity from anyone claiming to be making scientific observations. This standard must be maintained, must be attained and maintained whether the examination in question is of a simple or complex character. Any standard less than the highest attainable, where the rights and interests of suspect and prosecutor alike are equally protected, negates the credit of such a section and renders the probative values of its conclusions useless. Constable Fogarty had only been working in the examination section of the forensic science section for 3 months which I find surprising, I agree with Mr McNay that supervision within the section must be negligent in the extreme. That she had been taught none of the principles of scientific objectivity is even more alarming, although understandable when her superior appears to be also ignorant of such a basic quality. This inquest has demonstrated very clearly the resourcefulness, initiative and determination of members and officers of the Northern Territory Police Force in the field to intelligently organise every resource conceivable to achieve success in such a complex investigation. The non-observation or non-reporting of the spray bloodstain on the exterior of the tent resulted in this investigation being diverted in the wrong direction, with subsequent loss of police resources and considerable public money, not to mention the added traumas caused to each member of the Chamberlain family. No meaningful liaison appears to exist between the members of the Forensic Science section and the police officer in the field. From my observations of the operation of this section in this inquiry and other cases in the past, I recommend that consideration be given to it being re-established on a proper forensic scientific basis, with operatives prepared to achieve and maintain the highest standards of efficiency. To you, Pastor and Mrs. Chamberlain, and through you to Aidan and Regan, may I extend my deepest sympathy. You have not only suffered the loss of your beloved child in the most tragic circumstances, but you have all been subjected to months of innuendo, suspicion, and probably the most malicious gossip ever witnessed in this country. I have taken the unusual step of permitting these proceedings to be televised today in the hope that by direct and accurate communication, such innuendo, suspicions and gossip may finally cease. I doth find that Azaria Chamberlain, a child then of 9 weeks of age and formerly of Mount Isa, Queensland, met her death when attacked by a wild dingo whilst asleep in her family's tent at the top camping area, Ayers Rock, shortly after 8 p.m. on the 17th of August 1980. I further find that in attempting to remove this babe from the tent, the dingo would have caused severe crushing to the base of the skull and neck and lacerations to the throat and neck. Such injuries would have resulted in swift death. I further find that neither the parents of the child nor either of their remaining children were in any degree whatsoever responsible for this death. I find that the name Azaria does not mean and never has meant sacrifice in the wilderness. I find that after her death, the body of Azaria was taken from the possession of the dingo and disposed of by an unknown method by a person or persons name unknown. Did you enter a date to be fixed?
People would still point the finger. Do you think that's so?
I would not wish to comment further on what I said, Your Honour.
Do you have any comment?
What are your plans now for the future?
Try and live normal lives and back to our children, try and have a holiday in New Zealand and then get back to our studies.
Have the children themselves been very upset by the whole thing?
I believe so.
You think they can settle down now and lead a normal
I
life?
hope so.
Have you sold your story, Mr. Chamberlain?
I don't know what you mean by that. But we've certainly made no contracts with anyone.
Have you been approached by anyone to give your story, the full details?
We have.
Are you considering those proposals?
At this stage, we have not made any decision.
Pastor, do you agree with Mr. Barritt that dingoes at Ayers Rock should be killed?
I believe that dingoes remain beautiful creatures, rightfully in their own habitat. But that man's life is above dingoes' lives when they're threatened.
Perhaps we should fence the camping area to keep man away from the animals.
You think people should be kept away from the dingoes at the rock?
If the camping area was safe, things would be completely different.
Do you hold some grudge against the rangers or other people there that you weren't warned about the possible dangers?
I do not think I'd be entitled to answer that question.
Michael, why do you think people were so quick not to accept that a dingo, in fact, took the baby?
Because it's perhaps a first for Australia. Documented.
How do you feel about the standard of police forensic work in the case?
I wouldn't comment on that.
What has given you the strength? You've shown a great deal of stoicism throughout the trial.
Lord Jesus Christ is a very dear friend of ours, and he's our saviour, and the peace of God has kept us from being very foolish in our own lives.
In short, you're glad it's all over.
Wouldn't you think so?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Michael, we have something here, gentlemen, that you may like to see. This is a picture of Azaria as she really was. To prove to the world that she was, as we said, the most beautiful baby.
Do you think it's necessary for you to go to this length?
But
Sorry, Michael, could you repeat the purpose of
she
the...
was a beautiful child. And for anyone who would doubt this now, let them see this.
When was that photograph taken, Michael?
2 weeks before she died. Or 3, 2 or 3 weeks. And this is our greatest treasure of her likeness.
Michael, how have you not lost faith in human nature as a result of the way people have been?
I'd like to talk to you about it.
He didn't want to comment and say that they should be shot. But he wanted to know about people's lives are more important.